What if the reason you're still heartbroken isn't because of what happened, but because of what you keep telling yourself it meant? Maybe it wasn't just the person you lost. It was the version of yourself you tied to their love. You're waiting for closure, waiting to feel ready, waiting for the pain to vanish before you move. But healing doesn't wait for perfect timing. It begins the moment you stop searching for answers and start choosing yourself, even in the middle of the ache. One of the most difficult parts of heartbreak is realizing that what hurts the most isn't necessarily the person you lost. It's the idea of what you thought you had. There's a very specific kind of pain that comes from being attached not just to someone, but to a fantasy. It's the version of the relationship that only existed in your mind, the one where everything made sense, where the love was mutual, where the flaws could be fixed, and the future looked like everything you dreamed of. When that illusion shatters, it doesn't just break your heart, it disorients you. It's easy to focus on the best moments and forget the difficult ones. Our minds have a way of romanticizing the past, especially when we feel lonely or uncertain. We highlight the laughter, the way you felt seen, the moments that felt like they belonged in a movie. We downplay the confusion, the anxiety, the way you constantly second-guessed yourself. That selective memory is seductive. It gives you temporary comfort but long-term pain. Because when you idolize the highlight reel, it becomes impossible to let go of the story you keep replaying in your head. This is why so many people stay stuck in heartbreak long after a relationship ends. It's not just about missing someone's presence. It's about mourning the loss of the version of them you believed in. Maybe it was the version who would finally change, the one who would fight for you, the one who would wake up one day and suddenly see your worth. The pain lingers because you feel like you never got closure, not because something was taken from you, but because something you believed in never materialized. It's like chasing a finish line that was never there to begin with. The more attached you become to that fantasy, the harder it is to see the truth that was always present. Maybe there were signs. Maybe there were moments where you felt dismissed, where your needs weren't met, where the connection started to erode. But when you're invested in a dream, it becomes easy to explain those moments away. You convince yourself that love means being patient, forgiving, understanding, and while those qualities are important, they become dangerous when they blind you to reality. When the gap between who someone is and who you want them to be becomes too wide, your heart starts to ache from holding on too tightly to something that doesn't exist. A relationship built on potential can feel more intoxicating than one built on consistency. There's something thrilling about believing in what could be. You pour your energy into fixing, proving, or waiting, hoping that eventually the relationship will meet your expectations. But every time it doesn't, you're left with disappointment that cuts deeper than before. Not because they let you down again, but because you allowed yourself to believe the fantasy again. The cycle repeats, and with every loop, you lose a bit more of your peace. Letting go of a fantasy means confronting uncomfortable truths. It means admitting that things weren't as good as you wanted them to be, that the love you felt might not have been returned in the same way, that you were hoping for change that never came. These are hard truths. They challenge your ego, your heart, and your identity, but they also set you free. Because once you stop clinging to the illusion, you can begin to grieve the reality, and that's where healing begins. Grieving the reality means feeling the pain without dressing it up in nostalgia. It means remembering the silent treatment, the broken promises, the emotional absence, the feeling of being alone, even when someone was next to you. It means acknowledging that love, when real and healthy, doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't make you feel small, unseen, or unworthy. The moment you can sit with the whole picture, not just the beautiful parts, is the moment you take your power back. When you idealize someone, you minimize yourself. You place them on a pedestal and overlook how much of yourself you had to shrink to make the relationship work, how often you justified behavior that hurt you, how many times you ignored your gut just to avoid losing the fantasy. That is what you must confront, the cost of your hope, the price you paid emotionally, mentally, and spiritually to hold on to something that never gave you what you needed. There's no shame in falling for potential. It means you have a big heart. It means you're a visionary. But love is not a solo project. You can't build a relationship on dreams while standing alone in reality. And until you make peace with the difference between who someone was and who you wanted them to be, the heartbreak will linger. Because what you're really mourning isn't just a breakup, it's the collapse of a future that existed only in your imagination. That future may have felt incredibly real. You saw it so clearly. The shared home, the holidays, the laughter, the connection that felt unbreakable. You held on to that vision tightly, even when the present showed you cracks. And when it finally fell apart, you weren't just grieving a person, you were grieving the loss of a life you had started to build in your mind. That grief is valid, it's deep, but it doesn't have to be forever. Healing starts with acceptance, not just of the end, but of the truth that preceded it, of the signs you ignored, of the way your needs were dismissed, of the parts of yourself you compromised. When you can face those things without judgment, only compassion, you stop craving the fantasy. You begin to reconnect with your intuition, your strength, and your capacity to love more wisely in the future. You're not heartbroken because you lost something perfect. You're heartbroken because you believed in something that never fully existed. That belief came from a beautiful place, the part of you that still hopes, that still believes in love, that still dreams. That part doesn't need to die. It just needs to mature. It needs to learn how to differentiate between fantasy and reality, between love that uplifts and love that confuses, between presence and potential. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It's a quiet unraveling, a daily decision to see the past clearly, to honor what was real, and to release what was imagined. You'll still have moments where you miss the version you created. That's okay. But with time, those moments will lose their grip. They'll no longer have the power to pull you backward. Because clarity is the first real step toward freedom. And freedom is what makes space for a new, honest kind of love. One that doesn't live in your head, but thrives in your reality. There is a specific kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from the loss of another person. It comes from the loss of yourself in the process. So often the pain that lingers long after a relationship ends is rooted not just in absence, but in what that absence seems to say about your value. When love fades or someone walks away, it's easy to translate that experience into a brutal message. I wasn't enough. This belief becomes like a stain on your confidence, quietly shaping how you see yourself and how you show up in the world. The most dangerous part of heartbreak is when you tie your worth to whether someone chose you or stayed. Because once your sense of value becomes dependent on external validation, it's no longer stable. It fluctuates with someone else's moods, attention, and effort. If they were affectionate, you felt wanted. If they were distant, you felt discarded. And when they eventually left, it felt like something inside you shattered, not just the bond, but your sense of identity. That sense of devastation is magnified when you gave deeply, when you showed up fully, loved fiercely, and expected that kind of commitment in return. You poured your energy into making things work, into being good enough, patient enough, attractive enough, loving enough. And when it still fell apart, it left you questioning everything. What did I do wrong? What should I have done differently? Was I too much? Not enough? These questions don't just break your heart, they erode your self-worth. But here's the truth. Your value was never determined by how much someone saw or appreciated it. Just because someone failed to recognize your depth, your devotion, or your goodness doesn't mean those qualities didn't exist. It just means they didn't have the capacity, the awareness, or the willingness to honor them. Your worth isn't measured by someone's ability to meet you at your level. It's measured by the quiet, unwavering truth of who you are when no one's watching. Sometimes, in the aftermath of heartbreak, people carry this invisible burden of proving their worth through someone else's actions. They wait for the apology that might never come. They obsess over being seen, living well, glowing up, or moving on faster, hoping it will somehow validate them. But the healing doesn't come from proving anything. It comes from the realization that you never had to perform for your worth in the first place. You were already enough before the relationship. You are still enough now. Part of the heartbreak that lingers comes from the habits we form during the relationship. When you constantly adjusted yourself, your opinions, your needs, and your boundaries to keep the peace or to hold on to love, you slowly disconnected from your center. You made their approval your compass. So when that source of approval disappears, it feels like you've lost your direction altogether. Rebuilding your sense of self isn't just about forgetting someone. It's about unlearning the belief that their validation made you whole. In any relationship where your worth becomes a negotiation, you end up chasing love instead of receiving it. You work to be lovable rather than trusting that you already are. And this dynamic doesn't just wear down your heart, it distorts your understanding of love itself. You start to believe that love should be earned through effort, patience, or sacrifice. But real love doesn't demand your silence, your shrinkage, or your self-abandonment. It invites your full presence exactly as you are. The aftermath of tying your value to another person often leads to deep insecurity. You replay every moment in your head, wondering if you missed a sign, if you said the wrong thing, if you were too vulnerable or not vulnerable enough. But these mental loops are a trap. They give you the illusion of control, as if by analyzing the past enough, you can somehow rewrite it. But the past isn't yours to fix. What is yours is the decision to no longer let someone's inability to love you define the way you love yourself. That decision is not easy, especially if you built your self-worth on being chosen. When someone leaves, it feels like a rejection of your entire being. But the truth is, rejection is not always a reflection of your flaws. It's often a reflection of your growth. Sometimes you simply evolved past what could contain you. Sometimes the connection couldn't match the depths you were willing to go. And sometimes people just aren't capable of holding the kind of space your heart needs. And that has nothing to do with your value. You can't build your self-worth on someone's fleeting attention. It has to be built on something far more stable. Your values, your integrity, your strength, your kindness, your ability to rise after pain. These are the things that define you. These are the things that can never be taken away. When you start grounding yourself in that kind of truth, the heartbreak begins to soften. Not because you forget what happened, but because you stop making it mean something about who you are. It takes time to rebuild trust in yourself after tying your worth to someone else. Trust in your judgment. Trust in your ability to be loved again. Trust in your enoughness. But this rebuilding happens one small decision at a time. Choosing to speak kindly to yourself. Choosing to surround yourself with people who reflect your value instead of making you question it. Choosing to pursue things that light you up and remind you of your own brilliance. These are the steps that bring you home to yourself. And as you come home to yourself, something beautiful happens. You begin to see the heartbreak not as a reflection of your lack, but as a redirection toward your truth. You begin to realize that the very fact you feel deeply, that you cared, that you showed up with an open heart, that's not a weakness. That's your strength. Your capacity for love is not diminished by someone else's inability to receive it. In fact, that capacity becomes the foundation for a future love rooted in mutual recognition, not silent compromise. When you stop tying your worth to the people who couldn't see you, you begin to find power in your reflection again. You start recognizing yourself as whole, not because someone else says you are, but because you finally remember that you always were. This shift is subtle at first, but profound. You no longer seek approval to feel valuable. You no longer need to be chosen to feel deserving. You carry your worth with you. In every boundary you hold, in every truth you speak, in every act of self-compassion you offer when the pain resurfaces. That's how healing happens, not all at once and not without setbacks. But with each new step, you loosen the grip that heartbreak has on your identity. You stop needing to be validated and start becoming anchored in the quiet, knowing that your worth is not up for debate. It is not something someone gives you. It is something you discover, reclaim, and protect for the rest of your life. Heartbreak lingers the longest in the places where there are questions left unanswered. That gnawing sense of unfinished business is one of the hardest parts to live with. It's not always the loss itself that keeps someone stuck in pain, but the mental loops that come with it, the conversations that never happened, the explanations that never came, the apologies that were never offered, that hollow space between what you feel and what you wish you understood can feel unbearable. And in that space, people wait. They wait for closure, hoping that maybe if they can just get clarity, they'll be able to move on. But that waiting becomes a prison. It's natural to want answers. It's human to want to make sense of something that hurts so deeply. When someone leaves suddenly, fades away, or behaves in ways that contradict what they once expressed, it's disorienting. You question the entire timeline. You go back, replaying the moments that now feel out of place. What was real? What wasn't? Did they lie or change or just never care as much as they seem to? These questions can feel like torture because they strike at your sense of reality. If you can't trust what you experienced, how can you trust yourself? That's why people get stuck in heartbreak long after a relationship ends. They're not just trying to get over owe me one. They're trying to solve a mystery. The mind craves resolution. It wants to tie everything into a neat little box and label it. Here's why this ended. Here's what it meant. Here's why you're still hurting. But relationships aren't logic puzzles. They're a mix of emotions, timing, fears, and human limitations. And sometimes the truth is far messier and more ambiguous than any one explanation can capture. In the absence of closure, people often create their own stories. Some blame themselves, others create villains. But both paths are usually incomplete, and both keep the pain alive. Blaming yourself feels like control. If it was your fault, at least there's something you could have done differently. But that's an illusion. You can't control someone else's choices. On the other hand, making the other person the enemy gives temporary relief, but blocks genuine healing. Because as long as you're focused on anger or guilt, you're still tethered to the past. What no one tells you is that closure doesn't come from the other person. Not really. Closure is an internal decision, not an external event. It happens the moment you decide to stop needing their permission to heal. It's the point where you realize that no answer they could give you would ever fully resolve the pain. That even if they returned and explained everything, it still wouldn't undo the disappointment, the confusion, the grief, because it's not about what they say. It's about what you choose to believe now. That choice is powerful. It's the choice to close the loop yourself, to say, this chapter ends not because I understand every detail, but because I choose peace over clarity. That's the hard part. The mind will scream for one more conversation, one more text, one more glance backward. But the heart knows that the real healing happens when you give yourself what they never could: validation, understanding, and self-respect. Sometimes people think closure has to be mutual, that both people have to sit down, unpack everything, and leave with a sense of harmony. That's ideal, but not always possible. And even when it is, it's often incomplete, because someone else's explanation might satisfy your curiosity, but it won't necessarily soothe your soul. That's your work. That's the part no one else can do for you. It comes from confronting the hurt and asking yourself deeper questions, not about them, but about you. Why did it hurt so much? What did it awaken in you? What wounds did it poke at that were already there? Maybe the silence triggered an old fear of abandonment. Maybe the sudden shift reminded you of other times you were left without explanation. Maybe you weren't just grieving this relationship. You were grieving all the times you didn't feel chosen, all the moments you ignored your needs to keep love from slipping away. When you stop looking outward for closure and start looking inward for understanding, you stop repeating the cycle. That doesn't mean it's easy. It means you choose to sit with the discomfort instead of outsourcing it. You stop waiting for the perfect explanation and start becoming your own source of comfort. That could look like writing the letter you'll never send, saying out loud the things you never got to express, admitting what you needed that you never received, not because doing so changes the past, but because it gives voice to the part of you that feels invisible in the aftermath. So many people carry silent pain because they were never given a chance to speak their truth. They were left with questions, unfinished conversations, and emotions that had nowhere to go. But silence from another doesn't mean your voice doesn't matter. You still get to say what you needed to say. You still get to feel what you need to feel. And you still get to move forward, not because it was all wrapped up neatly, but because you are no longer willing to be held hostage by a story that refuses to end. When you take that pow back, something begins to shift. The focus turns inward. You realize that you are the one who decides what the ending looks like, not the other person, not the unanswered text, not the apology that never arrived. You decide that the story ends when you say, I've learned enough, I've felt enough, I'm ready for a new beginning. And that decision isn't made in one dramatic moment. It's made in the small, quiet choices you make every day. To stop checking, to stop hoping, to stop asking questions that only lead you in circles. That is what closing the loop really means. It doesn't mean forgetting. It means releasing. It means acknowledging that some things won't make sense, that not every goodbye comes with a reason, that sometimes people exit your life without the courtesy of explanation. But your healing doesn't have to wait for them to return. It can begin the moment you stop expecting the past to give you something it never did. This is not about pretending you're okay. It's about trusting that you will be okay, even without the closure you thought you needed. Because what you actually need is to reclaim your voice, your worth, and your peace. And the moment you decide to give those things to yourself, the loop starts to close. The ache begins to fade, not because someone else made it right, but because you did. Heartbreak often lingers because of the belief that healing must feel good to be real. There's a hidden expectation that one day you'll just wake up ready, that the pain will have subsided, that the memories will no longer sting, and that you'll suddenly feel strong enough to move on. But healing doesn't work like that. It doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It demands that you move forward even when everything inside of you wants to look back. It's not about waiting for the perfect emotional conditions. It's about making a choice in the middle of the mess. So many people remain emotionally stuck because they think healing is a moment, not a process. They expect a clean break, a clear turning point, or a sense of finality. But the truth is, healing often feels like dragging yourself through moments where your heart still aches, but your actions no longer reflect that ache. It's choosing to delete the messages even when part of you wants to keep them. It's resisting the urge to check in, to stalk, to revisit places or memories that bring nothing but pain. It's not about waiting for the urge to pass. It's about acting against it. What keeps the heartbreak alive is the illusion that there will be a right time to let go, a moment where the grief stops weighing you down, where the missing disappears, where the confusion clears completely. But that moment doesn't arrive before you move. It arrives because you move. Healing starts not in comfort, but in decision. in the decision to stop waiting for permission from your emotions and start taking responsibility for your direction. You won't always feel like moving forward. In fact, you might feel exhausted, overwhelmed, nostalgic, or tempted. But feelings, while valid, don't always point you toward freedom. Sometimes they point you backward into patterns that feel familiar but keep you stuck. That's why action matters so much, because clarity often comes after motion, not before it. Every time you choose to take a small, uncomfortable step forward, you signal to yourself that you're reclaiming your power. It's easy to believe that avoiding the pain will somehow soften it, that giving it time without touching it will cause it to fade. But unprocessed pain doesn't leave. It settles. It sinks deeper into your daily thoughts, your routines, your self-worth. It influences how you see yourself and how you show up in future relationships. That's why healing requires conscious engagement. It means actively choosing to face what you feel, not to wallow in it, but to understand it and then choose a new path. There's a quiet strength in doing something kind for yourself, even when your heart isn't fully in it. Going for a walk, even when your mind is clouded. Talking to a friend, even when you feel like isolating. Journaling the truth, even when it hurts to read it back. These aren't grand acts, but they are meaningful. They are acts of reclaiming yourself. Because heartbreak often makes you feel like you've lost control, like your emotions dictate everything. These small acts remind you that you still have agency. Waiting to feel ready often becomes a form of avoidance. It's the brain's way of protecting itself from more pain, which is understandable. But that protection can become a cage. The more you delay taking action, whether that's cutting ties, removing reminders, or stepping into something new, the more the heartbreak continues to shape your identity. You begin to see yourself through the lens of loss rather than through the lens of resilience. And this isn't about pretending the pain isn't there. It's not about rushing into something new or ignoring the grief. It's about honoring the pain while also not letting it make your decisions for you. It's sitting with your sadness in one moment and still choosing to take one step forward in the next. It's the balance of compassion and courage, of giving yourself space to feel while also pushing yourself to grow. There will be days when moving on feels impossible. Days when every song, every street, every memory pulls you back. That's part of the process. But those days are not a sign that you're failing. They're a sign that your healing is real, that you're feeling deeply, which means you loved deeply. The key is not to let those days convince you to stop, because the work you do in the hardest moments, the decision to keep going, is the work that builds the life you deserve. You don't need to wait for the pain to fully disappear before you reclaim your joy. You can feel sadness and still smile. You can miss what was and still move toward what will be. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future that isn't controlled by it. That starts the moment you stop treating pain as your enemy and start seeing it as your teacher. It has shown you where you hurt. Now it's showing you where you need to grow. The idea of readiness is often tied to fear. Fear of feeling again, fear of getting hurt, fear of the unknown. But waiting for fear to vanish is like waiting for the tide to stop rising. It will always be there in some form. The courage to move on doesn't come from fear disappearing. It comes from realizing you can carry fear and still act. You can be uncertain and still take the next step. And the more you do that, the stronger you become, not in theory, but in truth. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you've figured everything out, but because you've proven that even in the face of pain, you show up. You make choices that align with your future instead of your past. And in that process, you begin to rebuild something even more important than your relationship. You rebuild your self-belief. That quiet voice that says, I am capable of healing. I am capable of more. The decision to move on is rarely convenient. It's rarely easy, but it is always powerful. It breaks the cycle of longing, of comparison, of waiting. It takes the narrative out of someone else's hands and places it firmly in yours. And with each step you take, no matter how uncertain, you tell your heart that it's safe to open again. That love did not end with loss, that this right now is the moment where you begin again, not because you're ready, but because you're brave enough to try